Hello everyone, welcome back to Psychology 32, Lifespan Development. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, Early Childhood Cognitive Development, so we're talking about ages 2 to 6. And this video is going to be a little bit shorter than the other videos because there's only a few topics I want to focus on. Also, at the end of the video, we're going to talk a little bit about the discussion board question that's going to be due at the end of this week. And as always with the discussion board, remember, in order to receive full credit, you need to do a couple things. You need to, number one, make sure that you write 3 sentences in each of your posts. Number 2, you need to make an initial comment, an initial post response to the discussion board question. And then you also need to respond to 2 other people's posts. So just make sure that you get that done for full credit. Okay? So, early childhood cognitive development. What we're talking about with cognitive development is thinking. And we're talking specifically about the ages of 2 to 6. The main topics we'll be talking about in this chapter are going to be pre-operational intelligence, Piaget's second stage, Vygotsky's social learning theory, language as a tool for learning, and early education programs. Okay, so in the second stage, pre-operational intelligence, what happens with the child, according to Piaget, is that their thought process moves beyond the physical, tangible world. It moves into a world where they can start to think about things that go beyond just what they see. So a child that is in the birth to 2 age, when they see a dog and you tell them, you have a family dog, a family pet, when they see the dog, any dog that they see is their dog. The dog exists as, so let's say you have a puppy named Hannah, a golden retriever. And the parents introduce that puppy Hannah as, this is your dog. And the child sees Hannah as a dog. The child might see all other 4-legged creatures and that look like Hannah, and then might also call them Hannahs. Oh, those are Hannahs. Because the idea is that this dog is the same as every other dog. And this dog exists only in the physical sense of being a golden retriever and being the same in every way as every other dog. At the age of 2 to 6, children learn that a dog is a concept, or it's an idea. And there are a lot of different variants of dogs. So you could have a Labrador, a Pit Bull, a Rottweiler, a Poodle, and those are all dogs. So dog is a concept, an idea, and a category, rather than just this pet that you have in your house. So speaking of the Hannah example, I know somebody who has had a little girl. She's older now, but they had a little girl, and they did have a golden retriever named Hannah. And so every golden retriever she had seen was a Hannah. But every other dog that she had seen was a dog. So she really couldn't make that distinction, that the dog and Hannah were one and the same, but there were other things that could be dogs as well. Let me give you a different example. Children in this age can understand the idea that things have symbolic meaning. One of the things that the textbook talks about is the idea of a flag. So prior to the age of 2, children might see a flag and say, oh, well, that's a flag. It's got colors, this is the shape, this is the size, this is what it's made of, this is what it feels like. Okay, fine. That's as far as it goes. But children beyond that age, children in the pre-operational intelligence, ultimately might see that flag as, oh, this flag means America, meaning that there's some meaning behind the flag. The flag is not just an object. The flag is a representation of something else. And this goes beyond sort of the direct visual world that the children live in. So it is an advance in thought process. Like, for example, the Constitution, that's just a piece of paper. Right, but it means something. It's a set of laws. It's a set of rules that a set of values. Some people might say that means something, and so it goes beyond just this piece of paper. People say, well, why is the Constitution important? A 1-year-old might say, well, why is the Constitution important? It's just a piece of paper. I have paper in my bedroom. Well, no, this paper happens to really have guided people's views and beliefs and behaviors over a very long period of time, and so it means much more than just the parchment itself. Okay, there are limits to pre-operational intelligence, and we'll talk about some of those limits here. And if the slide deck that you are using, if you're working with your slide deck at home, you'll notice that something's been added here. Static reasoning has been added, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. That's not on the original version, but it's here in this video, and I'll explain it. So a couple of different things that limit this pre-operational intelligence stage. Number one is centration. So children at this age still focus on one aspect of the situation and exclude all other aspects of the situation. So one example I like to use is children might define themselves. Children might know the difference of boys and girls as sort of the gender stereotypical. Girls have long hair, boys have short hair. And so if you have a girl and you now cut her hair short, she might say, "Oh, I'm a boy." Because she's looking at one aspect of the situation. All she looks at is that hair equals, long hair equals girl, short hair equals boy. You cut my hair off and now I'm a boy. Okay? Or they see a boy with long hair and they say, "Oh, well, that's a girl." You say, "Well, no, that's a boy," And they say, no, boys have short hair. He has long hair. That's a girl. Okay, so that's centration. Egocentrism literally means self-centeredness, and when we're talking about egocentrism, really what we're talking about is seeing the world from your own perspective. Now, this is something that we have to be careful with, because when we call somebody egocentric as an adult, it tends to be insulting. It tends to be something that we say that's pejorative in some way. And one of the things that's important to understand is that egocentrism with kids, it's not pejorative, it's normal. And it's normal for children to see the world only from their perspective. So one of the things that I always talk about with egocentrism is, parents sometimes separate. And if they're separating when the child is between the ages of 2 and 6, one of the first questions that the child might have is something like, "Well, who's going to put me to bed at night? Or how am I going to get to school? Daddy drives me to school, and if I'm living with mommy and daddy's not there, how am I going to get to school?" And if you think about these are normal questions from a 2 to 6-year-old. There's nothing, there's nothing malicious about it. But if you think about, the process of two parents separating, it's a big deal. How is one parent coping? How's the other parent coping? What are they going to do with their finances? What does this mean for a lot of big things? But the first question that a child between the ages of 2 to 6 is going to ask is going to be, well, who's going to tuck me in? Who's going to read me my bedtime story? How does the world affect them? Okay? Children do focus on appearance to the exclusion of other attributes, where they basically focus on what things look like more so than other things at this age. Irreversibility is also important, and this is basically just not understanding that that something can be undone. So let's say you build a Lego castle for a child, and you take off one of the pieces of the Lego. "Oh, it's ruined, it's broken," the child might say. "This will never be the same again." "Well, no, I can put it back." No, it's broken, it's ruined, I don't want it anymore. Okay, they don't believe that something is done can be undone. Finally, one of the last limits is something that we call static reasoning. And static reasoning is a little bit confusing. Basically, what the definition means is that nothing ever changes. What was is, and what is always will be. Meaning that something that can become very confusing to children at this age is if you go to a local bodega and then the bodega closes and goes out of business, the child will be very shocked by this. Wait, I don't understand. Wait, no, but where'd the bodega go? Well, it closed, and something else will come in its place. Well, no, because that's where the bodega is. This is where the bodega is. And so, how could the bodega be gone? Right? It's something that children at this age have a very, very hard time with. So these are some of the limits to that pre-operational stage. Children stumble when it comes to these thinking constructs or abilities. Okay. Now, switching gears from Piaget to Vygotsky. Remember, Piaget talked about the child's thinking being limited by their development. So they haven't developed those abilities yet. Vygotsky looks at child development, a little bit differently. And what Vygotsky looks at child development as is a function of the child's social interactions and how the social interactions push their thought process further along. And so he focused on the child being what he called an apprentice in thinking, basically somebody whose thought process evolves based on how they're stimulated. Piaget was more of a let's see what they get to cognitively and let's see where they're at, where Vygotsky was more let's see what we can do to move them forward. Okay, so according to Vygotsky, children learn by being presented challenges, by being offered assistance through guided participation, through providing instruction, and through positive reinforcement and through encouraging motivation. We'll talk about this a little bit when we get into different school programs at the end of the chapter. But some key points to Vygotsky's theory are going to be guided participation, which I talked about before, where the teacher, whomever that may be, ultimately helps the child along in learning a process. So let's talk about tying your shoes. So you won't just say, well, take the laces, crisscross them, do bunny ears, put one over and through the other, and then you're done, you tie your shoes. You won't do that with a child who's 3 or 4 because they're never going to learn it. But what you might do is sit the child down and start doing the process with them and explain what you're doing along the way and help them through it. And there's some parts that they might get stuck on because of, lack of motor dexterity and fine motor skills. And you'll help them with those parts, but then continue to push them to do it on their own. It's not about taking over. It's not about doing it for them. It's about working with them. We talked about zone of proximal development. So, obviously we're still working in this proximal zone, but as the child gets older and grows and changes, that proximal zone is going to move. So the things that you're teaching the child should change as they get older. Okay. Now, one of the big things in child development, according to Vygotsky, is what the teacher will do for the child. So one of the hallmarks, the cruxes, or the cornerstones of Vygotsky's theory is what are we all? The child learns based on what they're exposed to, based on what they're taught. They're not learning because of this innate forward movement that Piaget really talked about, or alluded to anyway. They're learning because of how they're being taught and what they're being taught. And ultimately, this is how the child develops, through this, teacher-learner interaction. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about language. I know we've talked about language quite a bit, but I want to talk a little bit about language and language development. Okay, so there are a couple of things that happen when we talk about language and language development, especially at this age. And one of the things that we talk about is something called fast mapping. Okay, so the language abilities and skills from a 2-year-old to a 6-year-old vary widely. What a 2-year-old is able to do linguistically is much, much less typically than what a 6-year-old is able to do linguistically. And part of this is because of a process called fast mapping. What happens with fast mapping is that children develop these concepts or categories in their brain, these groups or these ideas, that ultimately allow vocabulary to increase very, very quickly. Because as they start to develop these groups or categories, it becomes a lot easier to start adding words to these groups or categories because you have the overall concept down. Okay, let me explain it a little bit differently. If we're talking about cars, think about all the different types of cars there are, right? There are compact cars, there are e-vehicles. You might even look at a motorcycle as a type of car. There are SUVs, there are minivans, there are hybrid SUVs, etc. Okay, so you have all these different types of cars. A young child, when somebody is 1.5 or 2 years old, if you have, let's say, a Nissan Maxima, you could point to that and say, well, that's mommy's car. So the child knows, well, car, that's a car. That Nissan Maxima is a car. And then you might then see a Chevy Suburban one day and say, oh, well, that's also kind of like a car. It's an SUV. And then the kid might say, well, is that a car? And let's say kind of and not really. It's sort of a car, it's sort of not. And so what ends up happening is is that the child has these two pieces of information. And they have, the Nissan Maxima and the Chevy Suburban. Okay. They don't necessarily know, they know that they're similar. They don't necessarily know how they're similar. They know that they're different. They know one's bigger than the other. They might be different colors, etc. But they don't know all the differences between the two different things. And so they have this one big idea. Well, the Nissan Maxima is a car. Then they have another big idea. The Chevy Suburban is an SUV, which might be a car, it might not be. And then we might show them a Toyota Prius and say, well, that's also a car. Well, what's the difference? Well, so that's the same as the Maxima? Well, no, that's not exactly the same, because that doesn't take gas, or it takes some gas, but not a lot of gas. But well, and the child has these three big pieces of information that don't really relate to each other. But eventually they'll understand the concept of a car. A car is a transportation vehicle that typically has four wheels, a steering wheel, multiple seats in it. It typically uses gasoline or some other power to propel from A to B, and then anything that looks similar to this falls into the category of car. Then there's the category of SUV. What's the difference? Well, typically cars versus SUVs. SUVs tend to be larger. They tend to have more seats. They tend to be higher. They tend to have more space, etc. They tend to have larger engines, blah, 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 whatever those are. So the child will develop these categories: car, SUV, minivan, etc. And then it becomes very easy for the child to take in new knowledge, because all I have to do is say to the child, well, we're looking at Toyota Corollas today. And once the child understands car versus SUV versus minivan, those categories, I can sit there, the child says, well, what's a Toyota Corolla? What's a Toyota Corolla? Well, that's a car. Oh, okay, the child understands. Well, this thing is going to have four wheels. It's going to have a steering wheel. It's not going to be as big as an SUV. It's not going to be shaped like a minivan, but that's what it's going to look like. Got it. So Toyota Corolla is a car. And, then I can say, well, also, we're going to look at the Chrysler Town and Country. Well, what's the Chrysler Town and Country? Well, that's a minivan. And now the child has an idea of what the minivan is going to look like. And it's very easy for the child to start putting these things into vocabulary, into their understanding, because they have the concept. They know what a car is. They got it. It becomes very, very easy for them to acquire new knowledge or new ideas or new vocabulary because of this fast mapping process. So fast mapping is the development of a framework, the understanding of a concept or idea that allows rapid word acquisition and vocabulary acquisition, because of the basic understanding of certain elements that are consistent across different elements in these lists. Okay. We talk about grammar. Grammar are just the rules that we use to communicate. Subject and verb rules are examples of grammar in English. And so what we're talking about with grammar is we're talking about that set of rules that language tends to follow. And those rules make a difference. They really do change the meanings of words. So think about punctuation as a function of grammar. If I would write the word stop versus writing the word stop, this would look very different. Question mark versus a period or an exclamation point. And it has very different meaning. And, part of understanding this meaning, especially in the written word, is because of the punctuation. But one of the things that children start to learn now is word order, grammar, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. One of the stumbling blocks in this age, and one of the problems that children have, is something that we call over-regularization. Over-regularization is when a child will use the rules of grammar when they don't necessarily apply. Okay? And we still do this as adults sometimes, right? We all make grammatical mistakes. But let me give you a couple of examples of what a child might do. When we add ed to a word, that's past tense. So the suffix ed means something happened before. And so when we're talking about past tense, we might say, if I completed something, we might say finished, ed, past tense. What a child might do is they might add eds to everything in order to say something happened in the past. So instead of the child saying, Timmy went to the store, to go to the store, the word go means, complete that action. It means move from one place to another. So instead of saying he went to the store, they might use the word go and then add an ed. So they might say he goed to the store, G-O-E-D. Another common one, and adults do this one too, is adding s's to things that make things plural. So, one table, two tables, adding an s to the word table. But as adults, we do this. One deer, two deer is the answer. A deer is one animal, or two of them is also called deer, just not a. So children might, always say, "Oh, Mom, look at the deers." No, it's look at the deer. Or one other one, what's the other one? Antenna and antennae. So one antenna, two antennae. We're not adding an s to that to make it plural. Okay, so children will struggle with these grammar rules, and that's normal, right? It's the overuse of the grammar rules. Use it once, use it on everything. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about bilingualism really, really quickly. We won't spend a lot of time on that because we mentioned that before. When we talk about bilingualism, one of the things to understand is that we're talking about something called balanced bilingual. Some of the common misconceptions about bilingual education, some of the common cons that people believe, which are misconceptions, are that, learning two languages slows people down. It can delay language development. The truth is, there's no research to support that. Typically what happens is that parents will teach one language at home and then send the child to school not knowing the language that the child will be speaking in school. So let's give an example. So let's say there are German-speaking parents, and the German-speaking parents came to the United States where it's majority English-speaking. And they came to the United States and they didn't want the child to forget their German culture and their German heritage. And so they only spoke to the child in German from birth to 5 or 6 years old. And they never really spoke to the child in English because the thought was, well, the child's going to learn English in school. You send this kid to school, they have no English knowledge and no English experience, and then you put them in class and the child now is falling behind terribly, because they don't know any English. They're only being taught English in school. And so you sit there and you think, well, my child is delayed in language. They're bilingual. They're not. Your child's not bilingual. Your child's monolingual. They only know German, right? They have to start over from scratch when you talk about teaching them English. And this is an important thing to understand, because if you're categorizing these children as bilingual, it ultimately is going to look like these bilingual children are behind in school or are behind with language learning, but they're not. They're perfectly on schedule. Most of the time, obviously, there's exceptions, but they're typically perfectly on schedule. The problem is that they're learning a second language from scratch. So one of the things that's important with bilingualism is there does not seem to be any drawbacks to true bilingual education. We're talking about sharing both languages equally. So there's a couple that I know, and they both speak English fluently, but the father speaks Hebrew and the mother speaks Farsi. And so the father understands a little bit of Farsi, the mother understands a little bit of Hebrew, but what they do with the child at home is the father tries to only speak to the child in Hebrew, the mother tries to only speak to the child in Farsi, and they speak to each other in front of the child in English. And so the child is getting fairly consistent exposure to all three languages, and he's learning all three. I don't know if he'll be fluent in all three, but he's learning all three, and he doesn't have any delays when it comes to his language skills and his language development. Okay? So there don't really seem to be any cons as long as the bilingual education is balanced, meaning equal. Okay, meaning the child is getting exposure to all languages equally. All right. The pros, one of the things that we talked about when we talked about language before was that language actually creates culture. And if language creates culture, then ultimately what this does is it changes the way the child thinks. It broadens their thought process. It helps them with abstraction. It helps them understand different cultures, belief sets, etc. And this can be fantastic, right? There's nothing wrong with this. Other pros are very pragmatic ones, right? The child can work in multiple settings. When they learn different languages, the child has more job opportunities later on in life. The child has expanded vocabulary later on in life. There's certainly plenty of benefits and plenty of pragmatic pros with bilingualism. But the major pro is going to be this different or broader ability or broader cognitive ability set where the child understands things beyond just more vocabulary, because language does influence culture and language creates culture more than anything. Okay, forgive me if the video is a little jumpy because I had to pause it for a second. So we're going to move on now to education programs. And there are 4 education programs: child-centered, teacher-directed, intervention, and experimental programs. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about child-centered and teacher-directed programs. Child-centered programs and versus teacher-directed. The main difference between the two are the sort of the day-to-day structure programs. Let me talk about teacher-directed first. Most of us know teacher-directed because those are the ones that we have most commonly in the United States. These are the classroom programs where the teacher leads the classroom. The teacher has a curriculum, a certain set of things that they want the children to know, and they basically teach those things. They teach on pace, they keep the class on track, and they learn basically this predetermined set of knowledge. They learn what they're supposed to know. That's different from child-centered programs. There are a lot of these, but one of the big ones that they use is something called Montessori programs. Montessori programs is one of the big sort of child-centered programs. And the difference is that in a Montessori school, instead of having all of this external structure where the children are supposed to sit down and basically study certain topics and then be guided through this stuff, and they're supposed to meet benchmarks as they do in teacher-directed programs, with the child-centered programs, children are basically going to a room where there are a lot of learning opportunities. There might be certain what they call self-correcting toys. There might be other things, puzzles, games that the child can interact with. And then there are facilitators that stand around the room. And what they do is they wait for the child to start interacting with a toy or a game or something educational in some way. And then the facilitator will slowly approach and then get involved with the child. And the child will use the interaction with this toy as a learning process. And the facilitator will use this as a learning process. So let's say the child, kind of walks over to blocks and starts building blocks. And sometimes they build it, things fall down. Sometimes they build it and things stay up. So the teacher or the facilitator might come over and gently turn this into a geometry lesson in some way. Fostering the child's, what they would argue, intrinsic love for geometry, or intrinsic love for architecture. And in essence, instead of pushing the child to learn a particular subject or a particular topic, what they do is that they allow the child to explore and learn the things that he or she really wants to learn. The thing to understand is the major difference between these programs is that teacher-directed programs foster extrinsic motivation, extrinsic being external. So with teacher-directed programs, a lot of what we're doing is we're training the child to behave based on some type of reinforcer that we're giving them, either a good grade or positive reinforcement or playtime, etc. And we use this as a motivator for the child. Where in child-centered programs, their goal really is to foster intrinsic motivation. So they want the child to learn because the child wants to learn, not because somebody's dangling this proverbial carrot in front of the child's face. And so the thought process is that child-centered programs allow the child to start to explore and interact with things that are fun and interesting, but they learn because this is what they want to do. Versus teacher-directed programs where the child is learning because they're going to get something that they want from the teacher. Again, candy, recess, whatever. And, there's a big argument between the two wherein, people argue that if you're spending your entire life learning because somebody is offering you something, a grade, recess or whatever, what happens when they stop offering you that? So what happens the day that you take a job? and there are no raises or promotions for working harder. You get paid by the hour, and that's it. Well, how hard are you going to work? You're not going to work very hard because you're not doing it because you love doing it. But with child-centered programs, later on in life, the job that you go into is a job that you're going into because you love it. You're truly passionate about it. And the belief and the thought process is that you're going to continue to learn and you're going to continue to work on yourself because you love this and you're passionate about it. Okay? Again, I'm being sort of a little bit minimalistic when I talk about this because I'm purely talking about jobs. But this theoretically would apply to the rest of the person's life. They do what they do in theoretically child-centered programs because they have an innate love for this. It's not that they're doing what they're doing because they think they're going to get something for it. They're not doing this just for money, or they're not doing this just for status. They're doing it because they truly love it and they truly care about it. There are benefits and drawbacks to both. Benefits to teacher-directed programs are there's an external structure. The child, learns certain basic societal expectations of behavior, where you have to learn to wait your turn, you have to learn to raise your hand, you can't just get out of your seat all the time. And then there's benchmarks for learning. I know that the child at a certain age knows this level of math. I know that the child at a certain age knows this level of reading because I have these benchmarks, I'm testing them, and they're meeting these levels. I know if they're ahead, I know if they're behind, etc. I can target the children who might be falling behind, but I can basically know that when they graduate, they know certain things, right? They've achieved a certain level of learning. The drawbacks to teacher-directed programs are basically that it's a one-size-fits-all program. Everybody learns differently. Some people learn more quickly, some people learn more slowly, and the teacher doesn't have the ability to adjust based on every single child's needs. They have to teach to the majority of the class, and they usually teach to sort of the bottom 40%, give or take. So the super fast learning kids, they don't teach to, right? Because those kids will pick it up on their own. The teacher doesn't have to do much for them. The children at the very, very bottom of the class, when it comes to learning speed, the teacher can't really teach to, because ultimately it takes too much time, and then the regular children, the children who learn at a more typical speed, they won't get to the benchmarks that are required by the state or by whatever testing service is testing them. And so the teacher teaches in that, from the 30th percentile to I say the 60th or 70th percentile, sort of in that range. And they teach to the student that learns at that speed. So they're missing people. It becomes difficult. There are a lot of benchmarks. There's a lot of potential for the teachers to what they call teach to the test. So we see the skill sets that the test requires, and the teacher will teach so that these kids pass these tests and don't really focus on, and again, this doesn't always happen, but they don't really focus on, fostering an intrinsic love for learning, or if the kid understands it, let me teach them how to pass this test, and if they know how to pass this test, I'm fine because now I'll keep my job. And it's a reality. It's a fear nowadays. So, those are some of the drawbacks to teacher-directed programs. Child-centered programs are the opposite. They foster intrinsic learning. You can certainly develop individualized education or individualized curriculums for these children. So that's fantastic. They're not necessarily teaching a lot of the basic social disciplinary expectations, because children are allowed to typically walk around the classroom. They're allowed to get up and move around and do things that other children might not be allowed to do. And, there are times where you're going to have to sit and wait for things, and in a world where there are expectations for rules and orders, putting a child in a world where they can't, they're just not sitting down all the time and they can kind of get up and walk around and do whatever they want, this might cause some challenges later. The bigger issue with, child-centered programs is that there's a tremendous selection bias. The outcome data is just not there. I'm not saying that they're good or bad. I'm saying we don't know. You see, with these child-centered programs, there's a tremendous what we call selection bias. And by selection bias, basically, the kids that tend to go into these child-centered programs tend to be not representative of the population. These kids tend to be much more wealthy. They have a lot more money. They have a lot more access to resources. And with some of these programs, they actually do cognitive testing before the kid gets into the school. And so they're taking these wealthy, very high-scoring cognitive children and putting them in the classroom. And it's hard to test those children and assess if the programs are making these children more successful when they graduate, or if it's the other resources, the innate ability as well as the financial resources that are making these children do better later on, right? A lot of these schools, especially Montessori, are going to advertise, there were 11 presidents had graduated from Montessori schools, 40 senators, CEOs of hedge funds had graduated from Montessori schools. Well, you have a bright, rich child, and who's to say that this child in any setting wouldn't have thrived later on in life, right? It's hard to say. And so when you're doing research on these programs, it makes it very, very difficult for us to get a truly unbiased or objective opinion of whether or not the child is successful because of the program and the intrinsic learning versus the child's potential for success because of other variables. So that's really one of the drawbacks with the child-centered idea, is that we don't know if they work per se. And the truth is, nobody wants to know if these work. The child-centered programs don't want to know if they work or if they don't. Well, I should say they don't want to know if they don't work, because if they don't work, they go out of business. So it's better to kind of not know and assume. And the other truth is that the public schools don't want to know if they don't work either, because every child that is taken out of a public school and put into a private school benefits the city as well, because the parents are still paying city taxes. They're also employing people, right, because people get paid to work at these programs, but they're still paying city taxes, and they're paying for a seat in a public school that they're not using, which basically gives more money to the public school. So nobody really wants to know if these things don't work. And I'm not saying that they do or they don't. What I'm saying is that the research on these things is limited, okay? So again, these sometimes do great things for children who are struggling in teacher-directed programs. Sometimes they just don't work for children. They can't function in them. But the empirical data on whether or not this leads to later life success is just difficult to say is fully objective and fully evolved. Okay, there are two other programs that we call intervention programs and experimental programs. I don't want to talk about experimental programs too much. I want to talk about intervention programs. So Head Start is one of the intervention programs. And basically, that's a typo there. It should say needy kids, not need kids. But basically what the Head Start program is going to do is it realized quickly that thinking in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you remember that from your intro class, it realized that there were so many other challenges to children's education that were beyond just the classroom. So if you can't afford bus fare, or you don't have money to buy food and you haven't eaten in a week, it's impossible for you to do well. And so what these programs, these intervention programs like Head Start did was it provided a bunch of the other things, like food. Sometimes it was job placement for the parents, bus passes, coats for the wintertime. It provided things for the kids that allowed them to focus their attention on learning. Because again, the argument was, if you haven't eaten for 3 days, what's the likelihood you're going to do well on a history test? You're just not. And so offering these ancillary services really freed these children up to do well in other areas, especially academically. And they found these programs to be very, very effective. Now, we do something like that here at Kingsborough. The ASAP program provides money for textbooks. We provide free accounting services for students at tax season. We provide free legal services for students, free notary services for students, because the thought process is that if we can offer these services for students, then we can allow them to focus on learning. And the data and the research on all this stuff is limited, of course, but from what we've seen, these programs tend to be very, very beneficial. Now, there's no guarantee, right? There's no guarantee that if I give you a textbook for free, or if I do your taxes for you, you're going to get all A's, right? Obviously, that's not going to work for everybody. It'll work for some of the people a lot of the time, a lot of the people some of the time, and some of the people none of the time, right? We know this. But overall, when you're targeting people that have such limited resources, and you provide them the resources, this frees up their time and ability to focus on other things like academia. And it can be a very, very effective way of learning. So these intervention programs can be very, very good. And the truth is they tend to be cheaper in the long run, right? The argument against these intervention programs is that they're expensive and we don't have the kind of money to pay to feed children. We're just supposed to educate them. Well, what happens to these children if they end up dropping out of school because they can't sacrifice, eating, right? It's either, work off the books or illegally, underage in order to make enough money to eat, or go to school. You can't do both. Well, what's going to happen to that kid that's starting to work at the age of 7 and drops out of elementary school or middle school, right? So think about the cost to society as a whole, and think about the cost of that child and that family. So these programs are expensive in the short run, but much, much, much cheaper in the long run, because the consequences of, child poverty are terrible. Anyway, so we'll wrap that up. We'll wrap this whole chapter up, and what I'll do is I will post a discussion board question on the board, and you guys will respond to that. Again, brief discussion on the topic, and the instructions will be on the discussion board. And make sure you complete that for full credit, and I'll be posting another lecture next week. As usual, any questions, email me.